Hello. Last Friday, we celebrated VE Day, and in our street we had street parties, socially distanced, of course. But we came outside with a cup of tea and stood at our gates, had some music, and toasted one another and celebrated exactly 75 years since freedom was won in Europe. Victory in Europe, VE Day. And that's the theme of our meditation today. Not victory, but freedom. But what would have happened if history had had a different outcome? I wonder if you've ever thought of that. There are not one but two television series out at the moment which consider that question. What would have happened if the Allies hadn't won Europe? Instead of being VE Day, there would have been VN Day, Victory for the Nazis. The first one of these is SSGB, which looks what would have happened in Britain if the Nazis had actually won the Second World War. And a little bit of that you can see if you go to Jersey, as that was the one part of the British Isles that was occupied by the Axis powers. That's SSGB. The second one is the man in the high castle, referring to Hitler and in his eagle's nest hideout high in the mountains. That is from the American point of view. What would have happened if the Nazis had actually built the aircraft to take their message of lack of freedom to America and had conquered the United States? I once posed this question to my grandmother, and I asked her what freedom meant to her. And she immediately said, well, freedom to me is Victoria Station. And I wondered what she meant. I thought perhaps it was the amount of platforms and the freedom to run around as a boy. I thought that was probably what she meant. But she said, no, it's not the platforms. It's the ticket office. So I again asked her what she meant by freedom being the ticket office at Victoria Station. And she said, I can go to the ticket office at Victoria Station and buy a ticket to anywhere. And the amazing thing is, nobody wants to know why. You see, first she'd lived under the communist regime and then under the Nazi regime. And coming to Britain meant a sort of freedom that she'd never dreamed of. And for her, not being asked to carry papers, not being asked to produce an identity, but not just freedom from that, freedom to be able to travel anywhere was just something that she cherished. You see, victory meant for her freedom from the regimes that she knew, but also freedom to live a different life. I was very aware of what freedom was when I first became a Christian. There was this wonderful sense of being free. And in those years in the 1970s, one of the most famous books at the time was Michael Green's Jesus Spells Freedom. This is my copy of it that I've still got. And in that book, in the preface, Michael tells us, having posed the question as to what freedom is, it says, well, it all depends on how we use our freedom. In other words, what freedom is for. There's a lot of preaching on the cross, and rightly so. And the message, of course, is that we're saved from sin and we're saved from death. And that's wonderful. But there's less on what we are saved for. or what we're saved to. Paul, when he was in Athens for the first time in Acts chapter 17, didn't just preach the cross, although he did. He preached Jesus and the resurrection. Jesus Kai Anastasia, the Bible records. So much so that they thought at the time that he was preaching two new gods, one male god called Jesus and one female goddess called Anastasia, perhaps his consort. And Paul was very quickly there to confirm that this wasn't the case. He preached Good Friday, freedom from sin and from death. And he preached the resurrection, Easter Day, freedom to and for. I wonder what you think we're saved for. The New Testament, of course, gives us several answers to that question. Paul in Ephesians 2 verse 10 says that we Christians are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand for us to walk in. We are created for good works. And Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, tells us to let your light so shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. You see, we are very much created for good works. But it's not just good works as social work, help your neighbour, save the planet, although of course we do want to do that. There is a greater reason, and that reason is to glorify our Father who is in heaven. That little reference to heaven reminds us that although we're saved for good works and to glorify God while we're here, that this is not ultimately our destination. Because Jesus said in John chapter 14 and verse 3, I go to prepare a place for you. I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. We're saved not just for good works on earth, but we're saved to glorify God in heaven. In this time of lockdown, we have freedom from a lot of the usual things that we've been doing, perhaps from commuting and shopping. But what are we free for? How are we using that time that we've saved? How are things different now? Is perhaps one of the questions that we are asking. What don't we need that we thought was so essential? And we're not just talking about surviving the next days and weeks. We're thinking about how this is all going to end, and perhaps in the future how things won't ever go back to be quite the same again. I've made one reference to my grandmother, who was a great influence on me. Here's another one. She liked Jim Reeves. Now that's a name that most people probably don't know unless you're as old as I am. But Jim was a contemporary of Cliff Richard, and like Cliff Richard was a singer and very famous in his time. But he was also a Christian, something that I didn't know. Now my grandmother had only one record of Jim Reeves, and I used to play it and enjoy it, and amazingly I still do. But what I didn't know at the time is that Jim had a massive Christian catalogue of songs, and one of the most famous was called This World Is Not My Home. So true. This world is not our home, and Easter reminds us of that fact, that we have a different destination, that what Jesus is, resurrected and living, we will be too. And where Jesus is, in glory and reigning, we will be too. That's the message of Easter. Our freedom was bought with Christ's blood on Good Friday. That's freedom from sin and death. But our freedom was given for good works, for eternity. We're saved for glorifying God on earth and then in heaven. Thank God for freedom. Thank God for Easter and for the resurrection that gives us that hope what we're saved for. May in this time when we are free from doing a lot of the things that we used to do, we consider what our freedom should be used for and ponder on that message of Jesus who said, I go to prepare a place for you and I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. God bless you.